going to start off a little bit and talk about where I'm at because it'll give some context. And that's a company called auction.com. And auction.com is the largest online real estate auction company in the United States. We sell a wide variety of different properties, business, residential, notes through auctions. And so data, as is pointed out, is really one of our key products because we're a marketplace. Little advert here. I've been there about 3 or 4 months now. I'm looking for a head of data science. If you know somebody, please let me know. I'm going to start this talk talking about something that my wife says I'm really, really good at, and that's talking about myself. And there's some reason for this. My name is Sheridan Hitchens, and I am a data junkie. My undergraduate degree was mathematics and statistics. I went to work out of college for Procter & Gamble, working in decision support. An MBA, loads and loads of industry data. A consulting career, lots of everybody else's data. A gaming career in Kabam and Play First. Lots of real-time data, lots of clickstream data. And now at auction.com, where there's lots of internal data, but huge amounts of external data as well. And it's interesting, as I come back and I start to look at my career full circle, several things kind of stand out. And I've come back now from being in kind of technology companies to perhaps a more traditional enterprise at auction.com. And it's interesting as I reflect on my early experience at Procter & Gamble, and now I look back at an enterprise in 20 years later, and I look back at what people are telling me 20 years later. 20 years ago, data was in multiple places, in multiple data marts, all over the place. Massive data integrity issues. We had, the spreadsheet was the most used tool, for data. And it was used for storing data, it was used for analyzing data, it was used for reporting data, it was used for manipulating data, it was used for everything with data. And that was the most common tool right across. And the most common management refrain was, why on earth is it so difficult for me to get a simple report that's accurate and consistent? And so I come back into the enterprise 20 years later, and what do I find? I find exactly the same thing. But I do think there are some things that have changed. And so if I look, the words have changed, right? Back in the early 90s, we were doing business intelligence. We were doing, decision support, and we were known as the nerds in the basement. You'll notice that every IT organization, if it's in a multi-story building, is always on the lowest floor or the basement, if there exists one. And today, we use we use these terms: big data, analytics, data scientists. I'm still waiting for the Nobel Committee to have their award in data science. 20 years ago, and I think Mark pointed out, we had what we thought was a lot of data 20 years ago. It was like, it may have only been megabytes and gigabytes, but we thought it was a lot of data. Back now, we have unbelievably huge amounts of data. We have, it's particularly if you're operating large-scale websites, you have unbelievable amounts of clickstream data, and it's unbelievable amounts of external data out there to mash up. The technology was primitive back then. When I first started out in Procter & Gamble, our platform was, an early version of SQL Server, which didn't work, running against Windows 3.0 as a client, which didn't work, running on local area networks, which didn't work then back either. And so, I hear a lot of people talk about technology, and it's still difficult, but the leaps and bounds that have been made in the last 20 years have made the technology problem perhaps not totally easy to solve, but at least there are options out there, and the maturity, even among the NoSQL stuff and the Hadoop stuff, even if you compare it to just 2 years ago, is much greater. And back 20 years ago when I was at P&G, we were a C-level nuisance. It was a line item to be managed. The benchmark showed it as a cost, as a percentage of cost, and you managed that percentage of cost as your business. And if it got too high, it was a problem. And today, I think it's a C-level imperative. People are realizing all across the globe in every industry, the data is a powerful commodity internally and externally. Now, as we think about these things, the last 2 points, I think, as my talk, are important. The technology has become easier. It's still, going to require a lot of work. It's still going to require a lot of good execution. And this is elevated right up to the upper echelons of the company. And what I'm going to talk today about is what that manifests itself within your organization. What are the key organization strategies that you're going to need to employ? What are the key tactics you're going to need to employ to really get the most out of your big data initiative? I'm going to finish up with some thoughts for the future and then wrap and do some questions and answers. So, when we come back with big management technology fads, right, we start back, and it all happened in 1996, right? The web was going mad, Netscape had gone public at a gazillion dollars, and your CEO came in and said, give me one of those website things everybody in Al Gore is talking about. And, and we carry on, right? 2009, we must become social, right? Social is everything, right? 2011, it's mobile, get me an app. And now, 2012, I've got to get me some of that big data stuff. And all of these things have a few things in common. They start off with this executive fad. On the surface, they appear like they're technology projects or technology initiatives. But once you start doing them, once you start getting underneath the covers, you realize they're much more profound. And the first three I talk about, they're profound because they change the way you do marketing. They change the way you interact with your customers. They change the way you do sales. They change the way you interact with your suppliers and vendors. They change your customer experience. And so each one of these have ended up being fundamental shifts for most business. And I'm going to argue today that I think that's also true for some of the big data stuff. I'm going to talk about what you can do. So, the key thing when we start some major business major business project is to think about the objectives we have. And I'd start by saying, to me, big data is all about better decisions. So often when I talk to somebody in a big data initiative, I ask them, what's your objective? And the objective comes out to be build a Hadoop cluster or some technological outcome. But if you're going to be successful in this, you have to define your objective in business terms. And the best way, in my opinion, to do that is to think about how it changes decisions, how it makes decisions better. And not just decisions better for executives or management, but how it helps your customers make decisions, how it makes your suppliers make better decisions, how it makes your partners make better decisions. And better could be a number of things. It could be faster. It could be simply more efficient, or it can be higher quality. But at its fundamental root cause, I'd argue that every big data project should be about your organization making better decisions. Making better decisions across the enterprise. And there are different ways to achieve that, right? I mean, we talk a lot about, the first point, supplying the tools or technologies, and services that enable that. We talk about, big data science teams doing kind of really heavy analysis in R and in SAS. But the latter three here are ways and means to achieve those objectives that are equally, if not more important. How do we think about educating and consulting with our line, with our partners inside and outside the organization? How do we think about fundamentally changing the culture of our organization? And how do we think of building capability, not just within an IT group or within a big data group, but across our whole company? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. When I think about organizational strategies and tactics, I think of a framework here, and it's a simple framework. Structure, people, process, and culture. Structure, the thing we're all familiar with. Roles and responsibilities, who reports to who owns what are the governance mechanisms. People, what are the core competencies that we need, not just within our big data group, but all across our enterprise to be successful? What are the processes internally we need to be successful? And culture. How do we go about thinking about the changes in behavior that we need to happen if we're going to be successful? And I'm going to start with perhaps the most amorphous one here, culture. We hear lots and lots about organization culture, and we often hear, well, we need to be, data-driven, and we need to be responsive and innovative. But we need to break culture down into the behaviors, the traits, the norms of the organization. A key tenet. Information is worthless unless it has the power to change a decision. This is a key concept from microeconomics and information theory. And let me give you two examples that kind of illustrate this. One, I go back into some of my earlier days, and we brought the consultants in. And we brought the consultants in to help us work out whether we should keep a line of business that we had. And so I'm traipsing into the room, and I see the consultants coming in behind me. And oh my God, they don't have little folders. They have binders. And my head slumps. And I know I'm in for a doozy of a meeting. And we're going through these binders in glorious Technicolor, these pie charts, 3D pie charts, visualizations like you've never seen them before. Page 100. Page 200, somebody please shoot me. Page 300, page 400, page 450, page 451, page 452. And there it was. This business has always been unprofitable and always will be. That's what the slide said. There on that one slide, we'd had the key piece of information, and we'd have 451 pages of meaningless context to set that point up. And we see this all the time in business. We just throw out these decision support tools with huge charts and things. It's the spray and pray approach to data visualization, as I call it. So a key bias that we fall into is not focusing in on the information in the organization that will change our decision. Second one, and perhaps even more pervasive within the organization. But I'm going to use a personal example. So, and this may be familiar to those who have partners. I'm driving along, and I do this, and traffic's a little bit heavy. And so I turn to my wife and I ask her, honey, do you think I should take the freeway or the side streets? And she comes back to me with a reasoned decision. Sheridan, I think we should take the side streets. I've seen this on previous days like this when the weather's bad and the freeway is always horrible. And I carry on for a few seconds and go, I think I'll carry on the freeway. And so what did I just do there? I asked for a piece of worthless information, right? I asked for a piece of worthless information because it had no power to change my decision, right? If she'd have come back and said freeway, I'd said, honey, I agree with you and carry on. If I was really being perverse, I'd actually change my decision and go on the side streets. But it had no power to change. And we see this all the time within the organization, right? We present something, and it didn't actually have the impact to change. And it never had the chance to change a decision because the decision had already been made mentally. So, this leads on to one of the key points over here, which is seeking confirming evidence. Now, I'm a huge fan of behavioral economics. And by the way, I think anybody within the data science and big data world really owes it to themselves to understand decision behavioral biases. If you actually go to Wikipedia, you'll see about 70 listed out. One of the most common is seeking confirming information. And we do this all the time. Business cases are just a great and classic example of that, right? We go around and we bring in all the little bits of information, the qualitative information, the quantitative information, we bring them all in to present a business case. We didn't go out looking at that case for our tool or for our system in that totally unbiased manner. We went in, predetermined decision, and we found data that supports that. And that's something we've got to stop within our organizations. I'm going to give you one piece of advice over here, or two tactics. One, you have to think, if you're setting up a data science group, you have to think of them as Switzerland, right? Totally and utterly neutral in their decision-making processes. And if you can't get away from the bias that somebody, the analyst coming through and providing all the good data that supports a business decision, think about a technique I've seen used before. Get somebody to be the agent provocateur. Their job is to go and collect all the data that disproves it, right? The counterexample, right? And so you get into a mentality of at least trying to balance out that issue around seeking confirming evidence. Stop the hand waving. I think you're going to need to think in your organizations when you've just got a bunch of qualitative stuff. I feel this, I feel that. And think about how do we get to organizations, where we're looking at it and we're genuinely data driven. And some of the best examples I've seen of this are executive. Our CEO stopped a meeting when I was at Kabam. He said, "We don't have the data here. We cannot make the decision over here. We need data, not feelings." And that ability to call out lack of information, worthless information is important. And coupled to that is sponsorship. This should be kind of second nature to people within the IT world. I mean, it's project tip number one in any major initiative, right? Executive sponsorship. Eat your greens, right? But you still see this kind of skunk work stuff going on. We'll set up a Hadoop cluster, and then it's like, what do we do? As Chris was talking about. So you need to think about how you go about and get an executive sponsor, and ideally more than one. I do think that when you're setting up a big data initiative, this is a good time to think about the branding that you have. You have your old term, your business intelligence group, your data group, your statisticians. Think about this as an opportunity to dump the baggage that you have with those legacy terms and work through with new terms. Make it fun. This is especially true in the data science world. I mean, a lot of the stuff that data scientists do, is pretty esoteric stuff when you get deep into some of the modeling algorithms. But there's a lot of stuff that you can bring back to the rest of the enterprise to make a difference. One of the biggest and most successful things that I did around forecasting when I was at Kabam is start some competitions. We used to have competitions to guess daily sales, and we'd let everybody in the organization do it. We'd let the engineers, the QA analysts, the business people, the finance people make predictions on daily sales. And we'd come through, and they'd do that, and we'd have a ranked leaderboard. And yes, it got people engaged around key and core metrics for the business. But what it actually also did was find us some insights. It turned out that one of the product managers over there had a specific insight about how stuff would tend to lapse back and revert to the mean in this situation. And it provided a key piece of insight to us as we were starting to think about our forecasting model. Push transparency. I have been fighting this battle for 20 years, and I have been losing. But I will continue to fight. Data is at its strongest when it is most freely available. And every organization I've ever been at has this, oh my word, it's going to get, if we open it up widely, it might get out to somebody who doesn't need it. It might get into our competitors' hands. We'll forget the fact that we don't understand our data and somehow our competitors are going to understand it, but it might get into our competitors' hands anyway. And we've got this fear. And I don't want to dismiss that fear. There's a fear, there's a chance that if you free your data, it will get into your competitors' hands. But that risk has to be weighed against the opportunity of letting everybody see the data, of letting everybody be part of how we're looking at data, letting everybody feel and understand the context in which we're doing things, and the empowerment, the drive, and the understanding that gives. And that absolutely has to be traded off. And I want to give you one specific tactic you can work towards to thinking about this. And it comes from the theory of nudge, which is in behavioral economics. If you default select somebody into something, there's a tendency for people to stay within that. And we have a default tendency in the BI world to say, this person should have access to data, this person should have access to this. You need to reverse that paradigm. Start with the premise. Everybody has access to everything, and then work through the specific rationale of why they shouldn't have access to something. Let's move on to the people side. You know, when we think about the roles within a big data group or initiative, yeah, we're going to look at some technical and analytical experience, but for me, the number one criteria should be around communication and influence. Can this person really go up, and this is particularly true of the leader, and to some extent all the leadership team, can this person be the change agent within the organization? And that person's main job or previous main job doesn't have to be something technical or analytical, because that communication and that influence, they've got to be a believer clearly, but that communication and that influence has got to be the key factor as you start to think that. And that's also going to be true, by the way, when you start to think about your data science team as well, because they can come up with the best models in the world. But again, if we go back to that concept of worthless information, unless they're able to convince somebody to change their decision, then all they did was generate more worthless information. High analytic experience. I've got some very specific kind of tips on this. I think the first is the analytic capabilities that you need to really, really exploit big data in the ways you need to do it may not exist within your organization. And I think you have to be very, very clear and understand that. I'd argue very strongly you don't need to worry about industry experience. Yeah, sure, it's great to hire somebody who's got the exact domain industry experience that you have. Far more important than they have that technical understanding and that than the analytic understanding and the thing. One of the best data scientists I hired in our games company came out of the semiconductor industry. Budget your time for hiring. It is a brutally, brutally tough market out there. Hands in the air, anybody found it really easy to hire some of the key kind of data architect and analyst roles? No. It is a really, really tough market out there for these people at the moment. And you need to invest your time. This is not an HR thing. You just defer, go get me some of these data scientists, go get me some of these technical architects who can do my Hadoop stuff. You've got to spend time as a leader going out there and hiring, and particularly as you're thinking in your early stages, I'd suggest that up to 50-60% of your time, certainly mine is at the moment as I'm building out my team, is around hiring. And let me be frank, you've got to understand and be prepared to pay market. Some of your time and effort here is going to be around your HR department and thinking about people outside the band, because they're going to come for you and you're going to ask about, an individual contributor, with a couple of years out of a PhD earning $150,000 a year, and they're going to go, what on earth is this, right? This is a manager or director level for us. The market is for skills over there, and there's the market is heavy and it's reasonably frothy at the moment, and you're going to need to be ready and willing to pay for market level. Training by the line, for the line. I think a lot of the time, we think about training. The first thing is, if your training is around your tools, then you've got a problem with your tools. The example I go is, I never needed to be trained on Netflix. Why would I need to be trained on my BI tool? So your tools need to be kind of self-explaining. But there's certain analytic capabilities. I strongly advocate that you look for your line doing that. And training by the line and for the line, in my opinion, has been most successful in this. We had, when I was at Kabam, we actually had our line do lunchtime sessions helping other people in the product area think about analytic capabilities. And these were not just simple, histograms of statistical significance. We had a session on using the Poisson distribution to understand data in low-frequency situations. Pretty hardcore stuff. Let's talk a little bit about structure now. One of the most common questions I get, and people ask is, where should this all sit? Where should it report to? Because that's something we can understand, and that's something that we can manage, right? And it could sit in a technology group or an IT group or marketing or line, and quite frankly, any of these can work and fail, and a lot's going to depend on the leader that you have in place over there. But let me tell you what is really, really important, regardless of where it sits. And that is really understanding, this is classic organization theory, but it gets missed a lot of the time, which is, do we understand the clear roles, responsibilities? Not just the people within the big data team, but how they interact with the line, how they interact with our partners. Do we understand the difference between kind of project type roles versus operational type roles, right, within our organization? Do we have the right governance methodologies here? Do we have the right steering committees that work with the line to understand our relative priorities? Coupled to that, the stakeholder interaction. And how do we get the visibility that we need to within the organization? I argue very strongly that from an analytics expression, you need to make it everyone's job. And when I say everyone's job, I mean everyone within your organization. And I want to think back to 40 years ago, and I want to think back to the car industry. And those of you with the quality movement will be familiar with this, so please bear with me. But 40 years ago, American car companies were having quality issues. Some would argue they still have it today, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And they used to go back, and they were going to Japan to kind of work out what was going on, because the quality of cars from Japan was that much stronger. And they went back and they looked at that. And then they said, how can this be? We've got a quality department of thousands and thousands of people quality checking everything. And when they went back to the Japanese factories, they found out that there was barely anybody in the quality control group. And they said, quite simply, quality is everyone's job. And I'd argue the same is true in most organizations, that analysis, understanding data, and particularly in this world, should be part of everyone's job within your organization. The corollary to that is thinking about the size of your big data group. This is not, if you start from the perspective of this is some massive, great big centralization effort, I think you're going to fail. You need to think about an organization that's right-sized and high-powered, and go back to the analogy I gave earlier. It is not a substitute for basic analytics and analytic capability within your line. Yes, you've got to be doing analysis that no one else can do, right? And focus on the problems that require the skill sets, and focus on the technology that would be unreasonable for anybody else to be able to do that. And so thinking about the size of your big data group, I think is an essential component here. Silos. When we think about, all organizations, it's a common thing when you do organization effectiveness projects, you're going to come up with silos. And I think you're going to run into big issues if you think about this project within very specific silos within your organization, like just technology or just marketing over here. A key technique that we found really, really useful, even if you have a centralized group, think about the location of those people. Think about how they sit near or with the people on the business side, so that we can force some of this working together and collaboration. So that when we see things like decisions getting made every day, we're there, we're in front, we're sitting next to the person who's making those decisions. Let's talk a little bit about process over here to wrap it up. I'd argue that you should think about your stack and your tools not just as another IT project, but as a product. As a product that's fundamental and core in the same way you treat any other product. And for those of us who are in kind of the data world or the web world, this will sound familiar, but think about it as a product. That you think about it from a resource planning perspective, you think about the agile methodologies that you might use in a web product, you think about product roadmaps, and this is true if you're using third-party or building your own stuff. And you also think about measurement. This is a case of the cobbler's children have no shoes, right? You ask the BI team and group, well, how's your tool doing? How's the measuring? How's the uptime? Who's using it? How are they using it? And they can't answer the question, right? They're providing all of this measurement data out to the business. but they're not looking at their own measurements and metrics and continuing to iterate and work on that. I think you've got to think about how you incorporate stuff into specs, into stuff, and so whether it's a technology project or whether it's a project around a new store, if you're retail, how do we think about how we're going to measure success, and how do we think about that, building that in? And then when we come to going to present the stuff, no recommendation without supporting data. A key tenet here, we instrument everything from the beginning. When I work, and there's a tendency like, oh, it's just a pilot, oh, it's just a beta, oh, we don't know if it's going to be successful. We'll do the instrumentation later. Reporting doesn't matter, right? That stuff will just drop off the stuff. No. This has got to be a core component and a cultural shift in how you think about instrumentation. Instrumentation is a fundamental feature of every business initiative, every business project, and every technology project you implement. And it needs to be laid out as such, it needs to be budgeted as such, and it needs to ship in the first time that initiative or project sees a customer. So we talked a little bit about some of the strategies over here around the organization. Let's turn a little bit to the future. And when I think about the future, there's a couple of things that I think are important, and we need to fit. You guys are out here. Most of you are starting up your big data initiatives. But what's this going to look like in the future? And I think there's a couple of big shifts that you guys need to be thinking about. The first is moving beyond traditional data sources, right? So much of what we see, traditionally in the enterprise is around sales and marketing data, and to some level, operational data. But how do we think about some of the other company data we have? How do we think about our customer service data, our consumer research data? How do we think about all of the industry data that's out there, all of the benchmarks that are out there? External data sources are becoming more and more readily available and a key source of data. I think we've got to start thinking beyond our internal customers. It's true, as Mark's pointed out, the data may not be your core product, but it's undoubtedly hugely helpful to not just your own internal consumers within your enterprise, but to your partners, to your customers, to your suppliers. And how do we think about our data products and our data warehousing strategy, and how do we think about the tools and services that we need to move towards our internal customers? And finally, and this is probably me committing heresy here, is we've got to think about stuff that's just not necessarily in the realm over here. If we think about strong analytic capability, we've got to, so much of the data science world is around, some classical statistical techniques, but there's a lot of other stuff that's important there from an analytic standpoint. Linear programming, game theory, a bunch of other analytical techniques. Qualitative data, how do we look and parse some of that qualitative data properly? And even further, when we think about analytical methods, abstract analytical methods, if we look back, at the history of analytical methods, some of the most successful have been fairly qualitative methods, like scenario analysis. You obviously used a lot in the Cold War, and there's a lot that can be learned from that. Those of you who've done big data stuff, you know that predictive analytics runs up against a huge, almighty great big brick wall when you have system shocks, right? There's no, prediction models generally do terribly against system shocks, and so you need to look at different methodologies and approaches when you come up against that, and scenario analysis, for instance, is one example. I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to wrap up with one of my favorite. I love quotes, and to me, in management theory, there's no better person than the godfather of management theory, which of course is Peter Drucker. And this is one of his statements that I think rings true. Checking the results of a decision against its expectation shows executives what their strengths are, where they need to improve, and where they lack knowledge and information. That's from Peter Drucker. And we'll wrap with some Q&A.
So, any questions for Sheridan?
Nobody got anything? So yeah, one of them.
I'll ask you a question. Yeah, so
How do you see people compensating their big data staff? Is it pure salary? Is it tied directly to the successful measures or the business value that's derived? Do you see a shift in that?
Yeah.
The question is how compensation is dealt with these data science teams.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent question, and I think that I'm going to go back one step and think about how do you think about what the metrics of success are for your big data team is, right? And I think you can start off, to start off with, you can start off with thinking some, if you want some quick hits and wins, perhaps some customer satisfaction metrics. Do people use your tool? Do they like it? Are they getting some value out of it? But very quickly, I think you have to start measuring people on the ROI. And if we believe that we're hiring people with influence who can also do technical and great modeling and analytic skills, then I think we have to measure them on our ROI. And when I think about the bonus structure that I gave to my head of data science back at Kabam, it was directly tied to X million dollars in incremental savings being delivered to the business. And so I think there's going to be a move towards that. And I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Very high level, because I know it's a topic in itself, but how are you estimating ROI to justify business spend?
The question is how to identify or measure ROI, estimate ROI to justify the spending.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can go back to the slide I gave, and I just pick a bunch of confirming evidence and present that. No, in all seriousness, I think in some cases it's tough, right? I mean, I'll be brutally honest about this. I think for us, certainly when I was at Kabam and now in auction, there's a leap of faith that's involved, and that leap of faith is around believing that it's going to help to better decisions. And so when I look at the cost and the outcome, and some of the ways I do it is I look at the decisions that could be potentially outcome and output, right? So for us, it will be, can we change the close rate of our auctions by X%, right? And what does that drop to the bottom line? Can we be better at the predictive value of what a house will actually sell for, and therefore can we better market and sell it, and what does that give us? And so I tend to go back and I look at the realm of decisions that can be made and come up with, not perfect ROI, but some sort of order of magnitude of the sort that kind of big data could give us. Does that help answer the question?
Yes. So the question is then if this stuff is so high context and a person really needs to understand the business model as an analyst, how do you, a number of things, how do you get there? How do you deal with this?
Yeah, I think you're reacting to the point that I made earlier, Andrew, which is don't worry about domain experience. Let me be clear, if you've got domain experience as well, that's great. But if I look at the skill sets that I'm looking for in my data sciences, there's some technical skill sets, there's some analytical skill sets, there's influence skill sets, and then domain skill sets. I'd argue that of all of those skill sets that you have over there, the stuff that is most teachable or the most ready, somebody can most readily grasp and get up to speed on would be your industry knowledge and your domain. Now, that's not to say that's not important. That's not to say that person wouldn't be behind the curve when they get that. But given the market that we have out here in hardcore data scientists, that's one of the trade-offs that I would specifically look at making.
Yes, in the back.
I really like a lot of the things that you said about culture and process and
Yeah.
all that. Who are you directing your comments to? What person in the organization is the person who bears this responsibility?
So,
Sorry, just to add another sentence to it, in terms of breaking down silos. So if one person lives in a particular silo, they're going to have a certain amount of agency theory going on. In other words, putting on his own domain, right? So how do you get a crossover business objective-oriented thing.
So the question then is, if you're breaking down the silos and trying to build a team that can go across and not get prioritized by the loudest voice, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, let me start off by saying it is a really, really difficult problem, and it is true of a lot of big organizational change within the organization. I think there are two key requirements to making that work. One is a leader of your business intelligence, so your big data project that is really able to extract executive influence. And I think the other is the executive sponsorship that you have within the organization. And I think if you're failing to have an executive who's not got the kind of leadership and communication skills heading up, and you don't have the executive sponsorship, you're simply going to fail at that silos. And even if you do, it's going to be a lot of work as well.
Yes.
Just had a question/comment on, we've been struggling trying to figure out, the ROI question as well around analytics in general and big data in particular. And just was wondering, it's like, how do you quantify, measure, or is it a waste of time at some point trying to do that, when you're like, well, this decision is directly correlated to that savings over there versus having some sort of leap of faith that, these guys are, tasked with this, and we're going to trust that they're going to do the right things and not weigh yourself down with all that, ROI, CBA kind of stuff. So I guess just comments around, real world, trying to quantify specifics to, results with specific analytic action. So
is it a waste of time to quantify the specifics of ROI?
Is it a waste of time to quantify the specifics of ROI? It's going to take you a lot of time, but let me give you a practical suggestion to that, because it's a very difficult one, and I think this goes around something that I perhaps didn't emphasize enough over here, but which is around incremental wins, right? And so if you look and you think about data science projects, right? So yes, you can start to do some stuff before you've got the perfect stack, right? And so just hiring that one data scientist or hiring some firm to help you think through, and yes, they have to go and move heaven and earth to get the data in the right area, but to show some of the impact and some of the decisions that you can come up with in an early stage, I think is one way to go over here, is running some form of pilot data science project to start off with, and use that as a base or benchmark, or at least a real piece of data that you can work with.
A question over here.
Yeah. So one of the things, at least in my organization, I suspect others, is we get wrapped around specific technology implementations. What I'd like to hear from you is, with respect to structural and organizational issues weighted against specific technology issues, is there a weight you can put out there? Can you put an emphasis on one of those?
So can you weight technology versus organization, and how much each is important?
Yeah, I work in marketplaces, and it's a little bit like saying, can you have a buyer without a seller, or a seller without a buyer, right? And I think that may sound a little bit trite, but I think I think it has to be it has to be both. And from the leadership standpoint, I'd argue that if you're thinking about your leader or somebody who's heading up the BI team, I would hope that the majority of their time is spent on organizational issues, is spent on thinking about the change that needs to happen, and that they've got one or more people who are thinking through some of the technology stack that they're working with. But I think if you're the head of this and you're thinking, and the majority of your time is spent on the technology, I'd argue that you have a problem.
One last question? No? Okay, well then thank you very much, Sheridan.